This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I am Dalia Shenlin. I'm your new co-host together with Gilad. And we'll be talking every week about literature and research and ideas and writing that have caught our attention. Our guest today is a lecturer in American history at Tel Aviv University and the author of the recently, a few years ago, published Roots of War, The World of Movement in the Confederate South by Harvard University Press in 2012. Professor Dr. Yael Sternhell, thank you for being here on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your book is a very interesting take on the Civil War, which, as you point out, has been extensively researched, but you look at it particularly through the prism of movement. And you talk about movement as both a tool and a tactic of war, but also as something that defines and redefines the social fabric. Can you explain what you mean and why you chose this particular approach?
It started in a traffic jam in Tennessee in 2003. I was a first-year graduate student, and somehow three of us in the history department at Princeton were able to convince our advisors to give us funding for what was basically a sightseeing trip of the South, to get some ideas, visit some archives, just kind of get a sense of what we could do there for our dissertations. And it was a long 2 weeks with a lot of driving. And on our way back, we crossed Tennessee from west to east. And Tennessee, as we all know, is widely shaped. So it was quite a long drive, and roads were really congested, weirdly. And at some point, I was thinking to myself, if it is this hard to move across the South in 2003 in an air-conditioned car, what did it mean for people who had to crisscross the South during wartime on horseback or on foot? And it was a mere intuition, nothing more. It didn't emerge out of the historiography that I had engaged with. It wasn't part of a scholarly debate that graduate students usually try to fit into.
Movement, after all, is really part and parcel of every armed
Right.
conflict, right? So
Right.
it wasn't, I'm assuming, not something that struck you out of nowhere, and you try to shape your inquiry accordingly. It is something that has deep roots in the literature and the historiography, right?
Absolutely, but weirdly, it is not a topic that anyone has examined in the context of the Civil War in and of itself. And I haven't really found studies that do this kind of work for other conflicts, though other conflicts are much more well-researched in terms of refugee movements. In general, the study of Civil War refugees is coming into its own only now. We're expecting the publication this year in 2017 of several books on this topic, and it is only now that historians are starting to think about the war as a war characterized by a humanitarian crisis of refugees, which is something that the field has not acknowledged over the past 150 years.
So how did you define movement for the purposes of your inquiry?
So when I started thinking about it more systematically and, like you say, reading about other conflict, how movement figured in other circumstances, I started realizing that movement basically really has two main dimensions that were important to me. The first is the way that the movement of human beings shapes historical processes, that movement in and of itself is important. It is not only the road to something more important, to the battlefield, to the home front, but that the process of moving from one place to the other during war is important. And then the other dimension that really came into my attention very early on is the symbolic meaning of movement. The fact that the way people move around, the way they look, the way that the movements both of individuals and of large masses of people figure is is important in shaping ideas about the war, how the war is going, where it's going. And a lot of the book is about the interplay between movement as an important wartime phenomenon and movement as a symbol of the deeper processes taking place during the war.
It sounds like those processes that you're talking about really have to do with some sort of nation building. You say the physical movement creates symbolic meanings and abstractions of nation, freedom, and victory. And this is very interesting. It makes me think of Benedict Anderson and Imagined Communities, because he talks about how in national identity people have to imagine the rest of their nation. But what you're saying is that people were in the South were watching the movement of troops and recognizing physically by seeing all this movement that we are a sort of kind of nation. But where did that nation building go? What happened to it?
Well, it became increasingly real and material and meaningful. I mean, the argument in the first chapter, like you so well summarized it now, is that the soldiers going to war were instrumental in shaping Southern public opinion and in really instilling the idea that the Confederacy is real when there were no other indications that the Confederacy would be real, that it is actually a living, breathing political entity that people should commit to and contribute to. But when the war actually starts, then the Confederate nation comes into its own. It exists for only 4 years. It's very brief, but nationalism does develop in the South over the course of the war, and people really begin to see themselves not as the real Americans as they used to before the war, seeing the kind of Northerners, the anti-slavery movement as profoundly opposed to American ideals, but they start to see themselves as Confederates. And the accumulative experience of 4 years of hard war, a very demanding conflict with huge numbers of casualties, with large-scale destruction of property and wealth, it creates an identity. It creates a lived experience, which is then alive for, the next 100 years.
Okay, but then perhaps the constitutive moment in all that was the ultimate failure of that nation-building process and, the definition of the Confederacy as, alive and kicking. At the end of the day, it died. How did that play into all this? Because when we're speaking about nationalisms, Benedict Anderson is a good example. I mean, we all look at it through the perspectives of essentially nations that prospered at the end of the day and became and materialized and crystallized. In the case of the Confederacy, it's just the polar opposite of that.
But I also have to add to that, because I think the interesting way that happens, from what I understood from your book, is that actually it's another form of movement that breaks down the social order that the Confederate South would have liked to see itself built on. And that movement of all those people you described, the clogged roads of freed slaves and women and men, soldiers, and everybody's mingling and mixing, and it becomes the symbol of the opposite process as well, of the breakdown of that kind of social order.
Right. So over the course of the book, I chart movement as both constitutive of the Confederate nation and then destructive of it. And I show how the social order of slavery, which was the building block, the ultimate building block of the South, both as a region in the American nation and as an independent Confederate nation, how that comes apart in motion, not only through the movement of slaves, but also through the breakdown of other social hierarchies on the road as white men become deserters, stragglers, as white women become refugees. So there's definitely a process in which movement becomes both a way to create the Confederate nation, but is also, at the end of the day, one of the reasons it breaks down and one of the ways in which its breakdown is evident. And again, there's this cycle that I see of mass populations moving and then other populations observing those movements and deducing from those movements the state of the conflict, which has a real impact on their commitment to keeping the conflict going. And then, the question of the Confederacy as this moment in Southern history, I mean, it's really a very interesting example, and I think one of the reasons that so many of us historians are so attracted to it is that it's a very powerful and all-consuming 4-year experiment in creating a slave-holding nation in North America, which at times seems very successful and very promising, and then eventually breaks down and surrenders. Its successes, especially in 1862, 1863, are real, and they seem to harbor real promise for viability of this political experiment. And in the end, the Confederacy does succumb to its own internal tensions and just to the sheer force of the Union war effort, which is strong enough to crush the South.
But what I find interesting about this is we were talking about this before. What we know of modern conflicts in, I would say, let's say the post-communist era, we're all aware of these nationalist conflicts, and they're usually ethno-nationalist, often with a religious dimension, as we have here in the region. We're not so used to conflicts where people of the same nation, culture, language, religion, color, just create a bloodbath against one another. And what you're saying is that they tried to create an identity, also a symbolically defined identity, I guess rooted primarily in this ideological distinction of slaveholding. But that wasn't strong enough. Maybe slaveholding simply isn't strong enough as a national idea.
It's one of the great questions of U.S. history and of Southern history more specifically is whether slaveholding and the social hierarchy of white over black was powerful enough to sustain an independent nation and a war of independence that took a huge toll on the population. It's a major debate among historians.
And what about analysts of the present? Some people, I think, in the Black Lives Matter movement might say that, in fact, America succeeded in creating a nation that is built on racial hierarchy.
Well, one of the things that we see in the late 19th century, and I think we pretty much agree on, is that the South lost the war, but its idea of racial hierarchy became the national idea. And that is not to say that the North was fighting for equality of African Americans, because it truly wasn't. It was
I also
fighting,
think that's an important point, not to get lost in history.
Right. It was the North was fighting first and foremost to preserve the United States of America, to prevent it from falling apart into these mini states and confederations that would threaten the very idea of Republican government and its viability in a world which was in 1860 still largely a world of monarchies and autocracies. But it wasn't fighting for any contrarian idea of racial equality between blacks and whites, which the South was opposed to. It was fighting first for union and then for emancipation, for killing slavery, because slavery was killing the Union. And at the end of the day, Northern racism was strong enough, entrenched enough, that the Southern way of life, which was then reborn not through slavery but through its version of apartheid, was able to remain very stable and almost unthreatened for close to a century. And in that sense, it's important to realize that losing a war on the battlefield is one thing, but
it can be a victory of ideas in other ways.
Right, but accepting the defeat of an idea is something totally different. And Southerners in 1865, defeated and humiliated as they were, never accepted the idea that slavery had been wrong and that white supremacy is wrong. And they went back to fighting for that idea as soon as the war ended, like literally as soon as they recover from the shock of defeat. And they will continue to fight for it, well into the 20th century.
Do you think that focusing on the concept, on the phenomenon of movement sheds a different light on everything that you just said? I mean, how does it feed into your analysis here?
That's a good question. I wanted to divert attention from what has been a growing concern for historians, at least in the early aughts when I was working on this project, on violence and death as the major themes or the quintessential experiences of Southerners in the Civil War. And what I wanted to argue was that violence, as important as it was, did not in any way supersede mobility as the quintessential wartime experience. And that mobility for most Southerners was more present and more palpable than violence. Most Southerners did not fight in the Civil War, and a lot of Southerners who fought in the Civil War didn't see that much action. I mean, there are soldiers in the Western theater that, lead a pretty quiet life during the war. But everyone experiences the changes brought by mobility. Everyone experiences the shock of movement.
Just to spend a bit more time on that, you're not talking only about the soldiers, of course, who had to go to the front line, etc. You're talking also about the civil society here. Can you elaborate about the sources of what made mobility such a palpable phenomenon for the average man on the southern street,
right?
Or woman, as your book
right.
often
Sorry.
Right.
No, because her book focuses a lot. This is not just me being politically correct. It's a big element in
Yes,
what the social breakdown you're talking about.
Right. So we need to remember that 80% of military-age Southern men were in the Army, and military age means eventually 16 to 49. So basically, men are in the Army, and they are in the Army both as soldiers, but also as deserters, as stragglers, as people who are trying to find a way to function in the Southern Army as soldiers while preserving their traditional prerogatives as the master class in Southern society. And a major argument of the book is that white men in the South never accepted the idea that they are not free to move at will. Before the war, white men in the South are the only people who can move at will. Neither women nor slaves nor children are free to move. Whereas Southern men are free to move in much the same way that they're the only...
Free to vote.
Right, free to vote, free to own property, right? It's an essential right of a white man in the South that they are very disinclined to give up when they become soldiers or even when they become officers. And I sort of show quite a few instances of officers refusing to accept the military hierarchy or the military rules that prevent them from moving as they see fit. And then there are women, and women function here in different capacities. They are an audience for the movements of men, and not merely a passive audience. They are the ones who feed them, who clothe them.
And who give them the flags and hold the flags.
Right, who give them flowers as they go to war. And they are the ones who watch them coming back broken down, walking instead of riding horseback, these pale shadows of what they used to be. And the question of what is a Southern man after he had lost the war and is coming home, often a cripple, often mentally shaken and disabled, and how women cope with that. That is an underlying theme here. But also women are the ones who process information and spread information. And there's another theme here of the relationship between the movement of human beings and the movement of information about the war, which has been a longstanding interest for me. And then there are women as refugees. And female refugees in the wartime South are very interesting to me because a white woman before the war is not supposed to move without a male escort. It is fundamentally against the unspoken rules of Southern society. Poor women barely moved at all. They worked 7 days a week. They went to church. They went to visit neighbors, but they did not undertake long distance travel. So for a poor woman, a yeoman wife, to have to travel alone as a refugee is a very disorienting and very novel experience, and not in a good way, I have to say. This is not a moment of women's liberation. And then wealthy women, the upper class, which is small, but it is so socially prominent and it is so visible, the movement of wealthy women away from their homes as refugees, it takes an outsized role just because the idea of these deeply privileged women who moved in carriages with a slave and a male escort and are now moving along alone. The slaves are gone. The men are gone. And they have to relocate because the Northern Army is coming and they are terrified of living under Northern occupation. It's unclear whether rightfully so, to be honest. Northern occupation in the Civil War was actually very tame in most cases.
I can't help but bring this interesting perspective on a conflict, on a terrible conflict, to other conflicts. And, you are also an outspoken, and you write often on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I'm thinking about the fact that movement, of course, the flip side of the question of movement is freedom of movement. And as we know, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's a whole population whose movement is deeply constrained. And I want to ask you, do you think that actually maybe one of the reasons why Israel is so strict about constraining the movement of Palestinians, could it be because they know that a breakdown of movement or a mingling of all people in the transit, in modes of transit, on the roads and transportation, could lead to the kind of breakdown of social order? Maybe not. Maybe they don't consciously think that, but maybe they instinctively know that that is a different social order than we have nowadays.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is the third major element in the book is the movement of slaves and freed slaves, enslaved Southern men and women for whom the war is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to leave bondage through their feet. And in some ways, that has always been the kind of driving interest for me about the Civil War, this moment of social revolution and self-emancipation that African Americans undertake the moment that they can. And I absolutely agree that you can't keep a social and political order without restricting mobility. Slavery is fundamentally built and reliant upon the restriction of the movements of the enslaved. And in the same way, colonial regimes and what's happening in the occupied territories for all practical purposes is a colonial regime. Israel cannot maintain control of the occupied territories if people are free to move at will. And so we have this elaborate and extremely oppressive system of passes and roadblocks and all sorts of means and tools of limiting Palestinian movement, both as a way to maintain order in the sense that Israel wants it, to maintain control of individual Palestinians, and to create a world in which people are in place, because when they are in place, they are more easily controllable.
I want to ask you one last question because we're quickly running out of time, and it's a methodological one about the sources that you work, the archives. How did you separate the wheat from the chaff, as it were, to try and find information, historical information about something that is essentially pretty mundane, about people, moving around? It's not like one of the pivots of history in this sense. Can you say a few words about that?
That's a great question. I realized pretty early on, and I was, a clueless graduate student when I started working on this as a dissertation, that what I'm looking for is very hard to catalog, that I'm not going to go into the archive and turn on the catalog and there's going to be a category called movement that will suggest everything that will have to do with this. So I developed my, own means of going through catalogs and started looking for particular words that I knew would be associated with movement. And then I chose areas of the South where I knew...
Such as? What kind of words?
Stragglers, deserters, freedmen, slaves, refugees. So that was one way. And then I looked at areas of the South where mobility was particularly important, like the Shenandoah Valley, for example, like the eastern shore of Virginia, where there's chaos that stems from slave movement from the very first days of the war. And then what I often did was when I went into the smaller archives in these small southern towns, I just went in and said, look, I have to see everything you have about the Confederacy because what I'm looking for can't be cataloged. And then just went through entire collections of letters, diaries, military documents by people or in areas which I knew were associated with mobility, places where there was a lot of action, places where war was a day-to-day lived experience rather than only something that you read about.
And the fact that it took you less than 30 years to complete the book is admirable in and of itself.
It didn't feel that. It felt like 30 years.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Yael Sternhell, a lecturer in American history at Tel Aviv University and the author of the recently published book, Roots of War, the World of Movement in the Confederate South. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for the conversation.
And a big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. You should listen to all of them. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org. Like us on Facebook and follow us both on Twitter. Join us next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.